Welcome everyone, DaveDev here. In today's video, we are going to get an understanding of how numeric variables work in PHP. In particular, what types of numeric variables we can use in PHP and what math operations we can use for modifying these PHP variables. The first numeric variable that we are going to take a look at is an integer. An integer is basically a numeric variable without a decimal point. It can contain up to 2 billion positive or negative values in 32 bits of operative systems, or up to 5 quintillion positive or negative values in 64 bits of operative systems. We can access a couple of const values that are defined by default in PHP, which let you know, for example, the largest integer supported by your operative system. You can check it with the PHP int max const value. You can also get the smallest integer supported by your PHP configuration, which is PHP int min. And you can also get the size of an integer value in bytes with PHP int size. You can also check if a variable that you are working with is an integer or it's not. You can do that by using isInt method, which will return true or false if the variable you are checking it's an integer or it's some different data type. And now if we save and take a look, we can see the maximum and minimum values that an integer can be saved on our operative system, as well as the number of bytes that the integer is taking. In our case, it's 8 bytes. And if the integer that we pass here, 1, 2, 3, it's an integer or it's not. Our next numeric variable is a float or double. It is basically a numeric variable which contains a decimal point. It can contain a value up to 1.79 times 10 to the power of 308, depending on the operative system. And it has a maximum precision of 14 digits. We can access these values with predefined const PHP variables, which are the largest float supported that you can get with PHP float max, and the smallest float supported that you can get with PHP float min. Now this number is the smallest float that you can contain between 0 and 1. It's not the smallest negative number. Apart from that, we have methods that we can use in order to know if our variable is a float or not. The first one is isFloat, which will return true or false if the variable specified it's a float or not. And the other one is isDouble, which will return the same if the variable specified it's a float. Now you will need to consider that float and double in PHP are considered the same data type because both contain floating values and both are extremely big. Now if we save this and execute it, you can see the actual values. For example, the float value is, as I said, to the power of 308, which is a lot of zeros. And the minimum value is to the minus 308, which is a lot of 0,0000. And as you can see here, it returns true in both cases because both cases are float variables. The next variable is not really considered a numeric variable, but it can be converted later on into numeric. This is a numeric string, which is basically a string that contains a valid number. Now, for operating with a string which contains valid numbers, we should use the method isNumeric, which will return true or false depending if the variable specified contains a castable number to an integer or a float. Now we are going to take a look on how to transform one numeric data type to another one. This is done by something called casting. The first cast is going to be from integer to float. As you can see, it's very straightforward. You just have to put the data type that you want to cast to in front of the other data type that is going to be casted, and the result is going to be stored in a data type of that type. The next one is going to be the opposite, float to integer. We did the same thing here. But you need to bear in mind here that float values contain a decimal point, which means that when you cast it to integer and store it as an integer, it will lose that decimal point, thus reducing the accuracy of that value. And the last one is going to be numeric string to integer. As I said before, if you want to cast a string to an integer or a double or a float, you will need to make sure that your variable is numeric, meaning that it can be castable to an integer or a float. You can do that by using the isNumeric method. And if that is true, then you cast it to the data type that you want. Now let's save this and let's take a look. As you can see, the first one is a float stored as a 10. It doesn't have a decimal point because it comes from an integer. The second one is an integer from a float. The original value, as we saw here, was 2.5, but because it's stored as an integer, the decimal point is lost during the cast. And the last one was a string that was casted into an integer. As you can see, we have two things here. The first thing is that the string has been casted into an integer, and the second thing is that the decimal point has been lost because it has been cast to an integer. We can use math operations to operate between numeric variables. The first one is addition, which will sum a and b in order to give the total value between them. The opposite is subtractions, which will give the difference between a and b. The next one is multiplication, which will give you the product of a and b. Division, which will give you the quotient of a and b. Modulus, which will give you the remainder of a divided by b. And exponentiation, which will give you the raising of a to the bth power. Now let's save this and take a look. One important thing that you should notice here is that the values have been transformed into float. This is because the moment that you combine an integer and a float into an operation, it will transform the result to store it appropriately. There are math shortcuts to increment and decrement values by 1 very quickly. We have the pre-increment method, which will increment a by 1 and then return the value of a. We have post-increment, which will return the value of a and increment it by 1 afterwards. And we have the same for decrement. Pre-decrement will decrement a by 1 and return the value of a. And post-decrement, which will return the value of a and then decrement it by 1. Let's save it and take a look. As you can see, it's 2 in every case. But why is that? In the first case, we have incremented the value by 1 and then we have printed the value. So value is 2. In the second case, we have printed the value first and then incremented the value, which is 2, but the value afterwards is 3. In the decrement, we have decreased the value by 1 and then we have returned the value, which is 2. And in the last one, we have printed the value and then decremented the value, which in the end is 1. There are other math methods that we can use. Minimum, it returns the minimum value between a list of arguments. Maximum, the opposite, it returns the maximum value of a list of arguments. Absolute, it will return the absolute positive value of a variable. Square root, it will return the result of a square root of a number. Round, it returns a floating point number to its nearest integer. And random number, it returns a random number, and you can specify minimum and maximum values to it. Now, let's take a look at it. As you can see, the first is minimum, it returns 1 because it's the minimum value. The second, it returns 2 because it's the maximum value. The third one, it returns 10, which is the absolute value of minus 10. The square root, it returns 3.16, which is the square root of 10. The round is 1 because it's the nearest integer of 0.6. If this would be 0.4, the nearest integer would be 0. And random, it returns a random number between 0 and 10. You can see each time that I refresh, it will return a different number. And this is the end of today's video. On our next video, we are going to talk about string variables and how to manipulate them. Thank you very much for staying until the end, and I hope I see you on the next video.